This is the Spyderco PPT, and this is peak weird Spyderco. And if you ask me, this is one of the best knives that Spyderco has ever made. So the PPT is definitely an older Spyderco design by this point. I looked and Nick Shabazz did his review of the PPT in 2018. So this knife you're looking at on the table could be 5, 6, 7, maybe even more years old. This particular version is in S90V with carbon fiber scales here. And the PPT, this is Fred Perrin and another P, and I think Turin or Turpin. It's a collaboration of three folks that have done a couple designs, the subway buoy, stuff like that. Definitely has a bit of a martial feel to it, a bit of a martial focus. The designers of this knife come from, similar to the Yojimbo, a kind of knife fighting and self-defense kind of background. And you'll see parts of that in the design as I sort of go through it. Again, this version was a rarer version. It was also made in S30V, either fully blacked out with titanium nitride coating on the blade, or S30V with just a satin blade here, much like this one, and G10 on the handle scales. Now, this knife was, I think, in the low 200s back when it was available for sale, but that was many inflation price increases ago. Frankly, this thing would probably be at least $300 or at least, $280, $290 if it were out today. 3.15 inches on the blade. Again, this one is S90V. 130 thousandths on the stock, but you can see a ton of distal taper. Comes very thin down at that tip there. And 5.2 ounce, and you see why when you put it on the side. Is a very thick knife. There's also, frankly, a pretty big knife. Let's get right to the size comparisons. Another high-end Spyderco here. You can see, not very big, but I should say it's big for what it is, especially in the pocket. Overall length about the same size as the Swish buoy here. To pick another popular Spyderco, your PM2, you're talking a little bit smaller in length than your PM2, but again, if you tilt on the side, you can see it's just a thicker, heavier, chunkier knife than your PM2 here. Let's get your Para 3 out here, and you can see, blade to blade length is only a little bit longer than the Para 3, but the overall knife is quite a bit bigger. Get a Benchmade on the table. Here's your mini grip. And then you've got your small Sebi. There's your small Sebi. And then there is your large Sebenza. So not a small knife, not a huge knife, but also not a small knife. So again, this knife comes from sort of a fighting design heritage. And what are some of the ways that you can see that? Very similar themes as the Yojimbo. First off, you've got technically a sheep's foot design, even though it's a bit more Warncliffy than most sheep's foots. A little bit of belly here, very low tip. A lot of drop here from up at the top of here. A lot of drop down toward that tip. The point of this blade is below most of the handle, and it's below a lot of your hand when you're, holding the knife. You got a ton of jimping up here, including 2 separate rows of jimping, including this front one that when you choke up with this front sort of choil right here, and then you put your thumb on there, you get way over that blade and have a ton of control over that blade. You are really just right on top of the blade here, able to put a lot of force into and behind that. And then you got this super thick, dramatically curved handle that not only is it thick, it's asymmetrical. You got this big, thick backspacer here, which I believe is titanium, super thick titanium liners. I called this a liner lock in a previous video. Somebody said it's a subframe lock. Fine, if you want to call this a subframe lock, call it a subframe lock. I think the distinction between all of those is pretty immaterial in the sense that this is a piece of titanium mounted inside a piece of G10 or carbon fiber that locks up by bending over. So whatever you want to call it that. The point is the lock bar here is relatively thick, and then what you can see is on the other side here, they put a thinner piece of titanium and a thicker piece of carbon fiber. So overall, the two sides of this knife are about the same thickness. They might even be exactly the same thickness, the right versus the left, but this one is more titanium, this one is more carbon fiber. Technically, that would make the whole knife a little bit lighter. They made this side as thick as it needs to be to have a nice thick lock bar for a nice secure lockup, and then this side where they just need it as a liner, they made it thinner. Again, Spyderco used to make cool, weird knives with lots of interesting, weird little details like this. Back when they were popping off all sorts of designer collaborations, they don't really do weird shit like this anymore. It's just cool. Tons of lock bar access here, and then you've got not only this crazy curve on this where it's like a banana here. It is curving way down behind your hand here. Whether you're choked up, that curve is starting to get into your pinky here, your middle finger is riding into that index, or if you're choked back here, this thing is curving right down into your hand, almost sort of like a pistol grip kind of thing. And then you've got this rock pattern on top of the whole handle just to make it even more ergonomic. When you're talking a fighting knife, whether it's the Yojimbo or the Little Temperance or this knife here, what you're really talking about is you're talking about very acute edge geometry, very, very sharp at the edge without being thin at the spine. So it's durable at the spine, thin at the edge, and extraordinarily ergonomic. And all of those things, to me, just make for a really good knife. And I'm going to talk about the PPT as an EDC knife, as an everyday carry knife for everyday tasks. And if you ask me, it excels in that role, which is why this is one of my favorite knives that Spyderco has ever made. So let's start with this blade. Again, 130 thousandths on the blade stock, but huge flat grind. Very, very tall flat grind. Again, I'll compare it to the PM2. You can see as tall, or realistically for most of the blade length, sorry for the car alarm, probably taller on the blade, on the amount of space it has to drop than the PM2, with about as much distal taper, even thinner down at the tip, and thinner blade stock at the base, especially in a highly edge retentive steel like this S90V, which has still pretty decent toughness. This thing comes as sharp behind the edge as just about anything Spyderco has made. It's not quite as insane as maybe the Swayback, the Centafonte, things like that, but this is an elite slicer behind the edge. Decent stock, big drop, that's what you're going to get, and then you combine that with the fact that Tai Chung just really, really knows how to grind a knife, even in these more, edge retentive, harder to grind steels. And you can see, you can picture, and then you see in practice, this thing just gets super, super slicey. If you look at the base of the blade there, you can see it kind of almost vanishes. At the same time, you got a low Wharncliffe with just a bit of belly here. This tip, super, super easy for scoring, for dragging, for cutting through things, cutting twine, all the kinds of EDC tasks that you want a very accessible, very useful tip for. This tip is accessible and useful. It's very easy to climb up on this knife to get to that tip. Very easy to push down. I had to do a task where I basically had to cut through stacks of cardstock for a little arts and crafts thing that I was doing for a project a couple months ago. This was the knife I chose for that because with the combination of being able to get your thumb on top of this, get your hand right up next to it, and then having that super accessible, easy to sight, very thin tip, you can even post up like this. You can get a ton of pressure down on this blade with a ton of control, and it's still very, very thin behind the edge. For the kinds of tasks that you might want an X-Acto knife for, or the kinds of tasks you might want a box cutter for, things like that, this is, from a blade perspective, one of the best folding box cutters that Spyderco has ever made. The blade stock is not so thick that it's going to drag through materials, super thin behind the edge, with an immense amount of control over the blade. And on top of that, it just looks cool. You got this, there's a lot of little details, just the way that this sweeps up here, the swedge here, the way this is shaped is not just a curve. It's not just they took a semicircle here. They did a little slant and a slant. Really nice, crisp plunge line here. This jimping is both aesthetic and functional. It's just very well made. It's honestly one of my favorite blades that Spyderco has ever put together. There are very, very few cutting tasks that I've tried to use the PPT for that it has not excelled at. And this is honestly one of my favorite blades that I've ever handled on any knife, let alone any Spyderco. Which then brings us back to the handle, which is wild. Again, this handle is thick, it is chunky. This knife is 5.4 ounces for about a 3-inch blade. It is heavy. It feels heavy. The balance point is like here. Or like, yeah, it's like back at this finger choil here. This thing is a chunk. And it's got this rock pattern, just a lot of milling here. Pretty heavy contour. Let me fold this up. Pretty heavy contour all the way across it, where you can see it's thickest at the midpoint, contours down to the edges. Just thick and just a lot going on. And then you've got this crazy banana shape where it just curves down more aggressively than almost any other knife you'll have. Unless you carry a lot of like cold steels, or Emerson's are the only other knives I've seen with this much of a curve. But just like this blade, you know, might be made for fighting, but those made for fighting tasks end up making it really good for EDC tasks. This super ergonomic handle, it's still the super ergonomic handle. You might want to be very ergonomic, so if you're in a knife fight in a back alley, your knife doesn't fly out of your hand. But it also just means when you're grabbing this knife, it's not going anywhere. Between this relatively secure front index, which, you know, this little nub here actually sticks out a little bit, so you're locked into this front spot just a bit. You got a huge scoop here for your middle finger, and then you've got this curve that is locking your back fingers into place. This whole nice rounded back rolls into your palm. And if you choke back, you got the same thing. Your front finger goes into this groove here. Your back finger just goes into this groove. You're posted up on this back jimping here, or the front jimping if you're choked up. Your hand is not moving. Now I could probably hit this knife with the blade with a baseball bat, and I would not feel that insecure. I feel like this blade would probably break before I necessarily lost grip of this handle. This rock texture here, the peaks of the rock are all nicely knocked down. It looks really cool in this carbon fiber. You get that nice chatoyance effect there. There's a nice little chamfer all the way around the edge. It does help with grip. It does help with traction. No part of this feels slick just because there's so many little edges to grab onto. Same thing with the G10. I used to have a G10 version of this. And then, as I talk about a lot, having nice big flats here, nice big flats here, just means that when your thumb rests on the back here, it's resting on a nice big flat spot with some nice sharp edges, and your thumb is there very securely. You can really push on this knife and you feel like it is not going to move anywhere in your hand, whether you're posted up or whether you are pulled back. And so if you're tearing through double, triple walled cardboard, the blade is going to sail through it, and you're not going to feel like you really have to grip hard with your hand. You're not going to feel that hand exertion because the handle is holding onto your hand for you. You know, I talk about handle ergonomics a lot as are you holding onto the handle, or is the handle holding onto you? Because when you've got strong ergonomic lines like this, the handle is holding on to you. You don't have to exert as much force to keep this nice stable in your hand because the shaping of the handle, the ergonomics of the handle are doing it for you. That means as you're digging through stuff, if you're cutting through drywall, if you're doing tougher home improvement projects, scoring into wood, you know, cutting through tough things in the garden, cutting through tons and tons of cardboard, whatever you're doing, or just really like pressing down on the table on tasks that require more of just a push, this knife is just going to absolutely shine at it because it holds onto your hand like very few knives that I have handled. And then you combine that with a blade that is ground to cut exceptionally well while giving you tons of control over the edge. It's really just an exceptional design for all sorts of tasks you might want to do with a knife. The only downside of it, well, the first big downside is damn thing is discontinued. So it's hard to get a hold of, and it can be very expensive to get a hold of it when you do. You will find scalpers that'll try to charge $350, $400 for this carbon fiber version, and will try to charge even $300 for the G10 and S30V version, and they're going to become scarcer over time because it's just not being made anymore, and that sucks. The other legitimate problem with this knife is the downside of this chunkiness is this thing is huge in the pocket. I mean, this thing is literally like Hinderer size. If I bring out, I just reviewed not long ago, where is my bombshell? There's my bombshell. Bombshell, big chunk. PPT, as big a chunk, maybe even a slightly bigger chunk. It's certainly heavier than the bombshell. And the bombshell is chunky by design. It's meant to be like cartoonishly thick and chunky. And the PPT is as thick or as chunky as it in the pocket. It's big, it's thick, it's going to take up most of your pocket. And because it's 5.2 ounces, you're going to feel it in your pocket as well. It's going to take up a lot of weight. It's going to swing around a lot. Now, you do have a clip that carries pretty deep and has a lot of sort of coverage on the pocket. So it is going to hold on to your pocket pretty securely. But still, even with that, the one downside with this knife is it is a big knife in the pocket. So, you know, it's a knife that I tend to have carried when I've got a day where I know I'm going to have either some very challenging and rough cutting tasks in particular, where I really want those exceptional ergonomics, or where I'm just going to be cutting a lot. Or on occasion when I want a really, really, really sharp edge, because this is, again, one of the sharpest knives that Spyderco makes, and one of the sharpest production knives that I've made. And most of the production knives that I've had that have been sharper than this one have been things like the Benchmade Tagged Out, where they are much skinnier, much more fragile knives that you wouldn't push nearly as hard as this, especially in S90V. The thing is, with a knife that is this robustly made, it's super sharp, but it's in no way delicate. You never feel like you have to baby this knife. You never feel like you have to be careful with this knife. You wouldn't want to slam this edge into, you know, staples, into wood, just because S90V, while it is a decently tough steel with a, with a thin edge like this, you would risk, you know, potentially chipping that edge, and you don't want to do that. But it's in no way, it doesn't feel like a delicate knife at all. And I can't think of another knife that feels this robust, that cuts this well. But the fact is, just because it is such a big, heavy, chunky knife, it's not something that I carry as a really everyday carry, because frankly, for most everyday tasks, you don't need cutting performance this good. You don't need ergonomics this good. But on the days where I know that I'm going to be going through, you know, 50 cardboard boxes and breaking a whole bunch of stuff down, like when I'm moving or something like that, or if I know I'm going to have to tear through a bunch of, like, if I'm cutting through a bunch of carpet, or if I have to do tasks like cutting through cardstock a bunch, this is really my go-to, like, okay, I got to cut a whole bunch of shit, and I want it to be as easy as possible. The PPT has become the knife that I go to, especially, you know, when you do want, you know, that tip performance, when you really want to get down there and press and apply a ton of pressure while having a ton of sharpness. It's hard to beat. So I said the same sort of thing with the bombshell review. Spyderco doesn't really make knives like the PPT anymore. There was a period just before and just after the pandemic, basically, where they were doing lots of designer collaborations, getting lots of very weird, very interesting, very cool knives out of it. Some of them were very, very good, like the PPT. Some of them were kind of flops, like the Amalgam. But they were taking a lot of shots on goal. Some of them were hitting, some of them weren't, but we were getting a lot of interesting stuff out of Spyderco. They have moved very much away from that and are making, you know, a lot of just PM2 variants, and a lot of, you know, things like the Bodacious, which is a moderate upgrade to the Shaman, stuff like that. They're not making weird stuff like this all that much anymore, and most of the weird stuff they're coming out with is basically Paul Alexander doing his thing, with a couple of things that he's put out over the last couple seasons. I would love to see the PPT come back. The PPT would be a great candidate for a Blade HQ rendition with Jade G10 or sort of Ghost G10 scales, especially if you blacked out this blade. That would be super, super cool and would kind of fit the martial arts theme to it. It would be really good, you know, with a St. Nick's red and black look. And frankly, it would be great to just see this knife come back, even if it were, say, $320, something like that. That's about where I'd estimate land for this carbon fiber and S90V version, maybe even, frankly, a little higher than that. Because I really do think this is one of the best knives that Spyderco has ever made. It's certainly one of the best Spydercos that I have ever handled, one of my favorite Spydercos of all time. And I do think it's a bit of a shame that Spyderco doesn't make knives like this nearly as much anymore. But the fact is, if you happen to have an opportunity to get a PPT and you want just one of the best ergonomic experiences and one of the best cutting experiences that Spyderco has ever delivered in a knife, it is hard for me to recommend this knife more. And I think that it is one of the most underrated knives that I have ever handled, let alone one of the most underrated Spydercos that I've ever handled. So it's super, super cool. Give it a look. And if you see one on Blade Forums or Reddit or anywhere else, I would suggest that you grab it unless it's for a crazy, crazy scalper price. Let me know if you've had a chance to handle this knife. Let me know if your experiences were similar or different. I will also say, folks that love the Yojimbo, if you love the Yojimbo, hunt this knife down. Because to me, this takes almost everything that is great about the Yojimbo and makes it even better. By the way, one last thing I'll mention. Action on this, it's a Taichung liner lock, frame lock, whatever you want to call it. I don't think I talked about action before. Super clicky on the lockout, super smooth on the open and close. I do wish that Taichung made more liner locks and frame locks because they do an extraordinarily good job of it. If you love the action on the Swish buoy, you're going to love the action on the PPT too. So, martial arts knives make for just really, really good knives in general. We should use the precepts of having really good ergonomics and a really useful blade that slices. I feel like that should kind of be things that are seen all the time as priorities in knife design. We tend to really only get them to this extreme when you have a bunch of people that are focused on fighting knives, trying to make fighting knives. But it's really cool when they all come together like this. This has been Clark the Knife. This has been the Spyderco PPT. Best way that you can possibly help the channel is give me comments down below. Let me know what you want to see. Ask me questions, because then I can make a whole bunch of shorts responding to those questions. That's how I get new viewers. That is the single best way that you can help me. So if you want to do that, let me know your thoughts. Give me some stuff to riff off of. Give me some stuff to respond to, and I will see you on the next one.